Detroit, November 1968. The backstage hallway of the 20 Grand Club smelled like cigarette smoke and spilled liquor soaked into wooden floors. Marvin Gaye stood in the corner, hands deep in his pockets, shoulders hunched, watching David Ruffin work the room like he owned it. David had just left the Temptations, and his ego was running hotter than the Detroit furnaces outside. He wore a burgundy suit that probably cost a month's salary, telling anyone who would listen that he was done being one voice among five. He was the voice, the only voice that mattered. Marvin wasn't in the mood for any of it. He was barely holding himself together. Tammy Terrell had collapsed on stage in October 1967, and watching her deteriorate through surgery after surgery was destroying him from the inside. Every time he sang a love song, every time someone told him how lucky he wanted to scream. But Motown had obligations, and Marvin had learned long ago that his feelings didn't matter when there was money to be made. David noticed Marvin in the corner, walked over with that swagger he'd perfected on stage, and leaned against the wall beside him. "Studio Marvin," David said, half smiling. "How you feeling tonight?" Marvin nodded, didn't look up. "I'm good, David. You know what the difference is between you and me?" David wasn't asking. He was declaring. "You're a studio artist. You need the mixing board, the overdubs, the perfect take. Me, I'm live. I'm raw. I'm what soul really is." Marvin finally looked at him. David was grinning, but there was something sharp underneath it. He was testing, probing, looking for a reaction. "Soul is soul," Marvin said quietly. "Doesn't matter where it comes from." David laughed, shook his head. "Nah, man. Real soul happens in front of people. One microphone, no safety net. You sing what you feel in that exact moment, and if you can't do that, you're just a technician." The words hung in the air. A few other musicians had started listening now. This was the kind of exchange that became legend in Detroit music circles. David Ruffin, fresh off his Temptations exit, challenging Marvin Gaye in front of witnesses. Marvin didn't respond. He just looked at David with tired eyes. David saw the silence as weakness. "Tell you what, there's about 50 people out there tonight. Small crowd, intimate. Let's both do one song. You, me, single microphone. No backing tracks, no studio magic. Let's see who really has soul." Marvin felt something tighten in his chest. He didn't want this. He didn't want to prove anything to David Ruffin or anyone else. He wanted to go home, close the curtains, and disappear into the quiet where no one could ask him to perform emotions he didn't have anymore. But everyone was watching now, waiting. "All right," Marvin said softly. David clapped his hands once, turned to the small crowd that had gathered. "You heard it. Me and Marvin. One song each. Let the people decide." The club manager, an older man named Ellis, who had been running the 20 Grand for 15 years, pulled them both aside. "You serious about this? Because if you are, I'll clear the stage. Give you both the room." David nodded, already walking toward the stage entrance. Marvin followed slowly, like a man walking to his own execution. The 20 Grand wasn't a large venue. It held maybe 200 people when packed, but tonight there were only about 50 scattered across the tables. Most of them were locals, people who came for the cheap drinks and the occasional live performance. They didn't know they were about to witness something that would be retold for decades. Ellis stepped onto the small stage, adjusted the single microphone in the center, and announced what was happening. "All right, folks, we got something special tonight. David Ruffin and Marvin Gaye are going to each do a song. No band, no backing, just voice. So settle in and pay attention." The room went quiet. David walked out first, confident, shoulders back. He took the microphone off the stand, held it in his hand, looked out at the audience like he was preparing to conquer them. "Y'all know this one," he said, and then he started singing "My Girl." His voice filled the room immediately, raw, powerful, technically flawless. He held the microphone close, letting his voice wrap around each word with precision that only came from years of training and natural talent. When he hit the chorus, he pulled back, letting his voice project naturally, filling every corner of the club. He added runs and embellishments that showed off his range, taking the familiar melody and making it his own through sheer vocal athleticism. He could growl low notes that rumbled in people's chests, then flip into a falsetto so clean it sounded like a different person. By the second chorus, half the room was swaying along. A woman near the front had closed her eyes, mouthing the words. When he finished, holding the final note longer than necessary, the applause was immediate and enthusiastic. David had delivered soul in its most powerful form. He handed the microphone back, nodded at the crowd with a smile that said he knew exactly how good he was, and walked off stage. Then it was Marvin's turn. He walked onto the stage slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. For a moment, he just stood there in the spotlight, looking at the microphone like it was something dangerous. Someone coughed. A glass clinked at the bar. Marvin picked up the microphone, held it loosely, and closed his eyes. Not for effect. He closed them because looking at the audience felt like too much. He didn't announce what he was going to sing. He just started. It was an early version of What's Going On, a song he'd been working on privately, a song Motown would never approve. The melody was simple, almost fragile, built on just a few notes that repeated like a question with no answer. And Marvin's voice was nothing like David's. It wasn't powerful or commanding. It was soft, uncertain, cracked in places where emotion pushed through technique. But in every word, there was something raw and unprotected. Vulnerability, pain, a man asking questions he didn't have answers to. Mother, mother, there's too many of you crying. His voice barely rose above a whisper, and people had to lean forward to hear him. Brother, 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 there's far too many of you dying. The air changed, heavier. People stopped moving. The bartender stopped pouring. Marvin kept his eyes closed through the entire song. He wasn't seeing the club. He was seeing Tammy in a hospital bed. He was seeing his own face in the mirror that morning, barely recognizing himself. He was seeing every moment he'd been told to smile, to perform, to be the romantic prince when all he felt inside was emptiness. You know, we've got to find a way to bring some loving here today. His voice broke slightly on loving, and he didn't try to hide it. He let it break because that's what was happening inside him. And for the first time in his career, he was letting people hear what it sounded like when Marvin Gaye stopped performing and started confessing. The room didn't sway. They didn't clap along. They just listened, frozen, some barely breathing. Because what they were hearing wasn't a performance. It was an open wound being shown to strangers. When Marvin finished, there was no immediate applause. Just silence so complete you could hear the radiator hissing in the back. Then slowly, someone started clapping. Not enthusiastically, carefully, like they weren't sure if applause was appropriate. Then more people joined. But it wasn't like David's applause. It was quieter, more respectful, almost reverent, like they'd been allowed into a room they weren't supposed to enter. Some people weren't clapping at all. They were just sitting, staring, processing something they didn't have words for yet. Marvin opened his eyes, looked confused for a split second, like he'd forgotten where he was. He put the microphone back, his hands shaking slightly, and walked off stage without looking at anyone. He just disappeared into the back hallway, like he was trying to escape what he'd revealed. David was standing in the dim hallway, leaning against the wall, but the grin was gone. When Marvin walked past, David reached out and touched his arm. "Wait," David said quietly. Marvin stopped but didn't turn around. "What was that?" David's voice had changed. The bravado was gone. Marvin turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" "That song. I sang mine perfect. Perfect notes. Perfect delivery. Everything I've spent 15 years learning." David shook his head slowly. "You didn't even sound like you were trying. You sounded like you were falling apart." Marvin didn't have an answer, because David was right. David looked down at the floor. "I gave them power, everything I know how to do, and they clapped because it was impressive." He looked back up. "You gave them yourself, the parts you don't want people to see. And they didn't clap because it was impressive. They clapped because they felt it." Marvin wanted to tell David that power mattered too, that what he'd done was its own kind of brave, but he was too tired. "I thought soul was about being untouchable," David said softly. "About showing people you were stronger than whatever tried to break you. And now?" David was quiet. Now I don't know what soul is anymore. Behind him, David stood alone in the hallway, replaying every note he'd sung and wondering why perfection had somehow felt like it wasn't enough. Years later, in 1981, David Ruffin was asked about that night in an interview. By then, his career had spiraled. Drug addiction, financial trouble, legal problems. The journalist asked if he had any regrets about leaving the Temptations. David thought for a long time, his hands shaking slightly. "I thought soul was about strength," he said finally, "about showing people you were untouchable. I thought if I sang loud enough, strong enough, perfect enough, that was soul." The interviewer waited. "Then I heard Marvin Gaye sing one song, and he didn't sound strong at all. He sounded broken, and everyone in that room felt it more than anything I'd ever done." "What did that teach you?" David looked at the camera, his eyes tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. "Soul isn't about showing people your power. It's about showing them your wounds. It's about being brave enough to stand in front of strangers and let them see the parts of you that you spend most of your life hiding." He paused. "I was performing strength because I thought that's what made me valuable. Marvin was confessing pain because that's all he had left. And the room knew the difference." The interviewer asked if he ever talked to Marvin about that night. David shook his head. "No, I was too proud. Thought about calling him 100 times. But by the time I understood what had really happened, it was too late. Marvin was gone. Marvin Gaye was shot and killed by his father on April 1st, 1984, one day before his 45th birthday. By then, What's Going On had become one of the most important albums in music history, proving that vulnerability could be more powerful than perfection. David Ruffin died 7 years later, in 1991, found in a Philadelphia hospital after a drug overdose in the back of a limousine, carried there by someone who didn't even know his name. Two voices, two versions of soul. One sought power and perfection, believing that strength was what made you matter. The other sought truth, even when the truth was painful, even when it meant revealing the parts of yourself you'd been taught to hide. The lesson wasn't that technique didn't matter. David Ruffin was an extraordinary vocalist. But what happened that night was a reminder that all the technique in the world can't create connection if there's nothing underneath it. Perfection might impress people, but vulnerability makes them feel something they can't shake off. Marvin never knew the full impact of that night. He didn't know that David spent years thinking about it, that it haunted him in ways both destructive and enlightening. Marvin was too busy carrying his own weight, his own grief, his own slow collapse. But the music knew. What's Going On knew. Every note of that album carried the understanding that the most powerful thing an artist can do is stop performing and start confessing. And somewhere in the archives of Detroit music history, in the memories of the 50 people who were there, the story persists. The night David Ruffin challenged Marvin Gaye to prove who had real soul and learned that soul isn't something you demonstrate, it's something you risk. It's the courage to stand in front of strangers and bleed in music form, knowing they might not applaud, knowing they might look away, but doing it anyway because it's the only truth you have left to tell.